Welcome to CBAW Loves, a book club podcast from Community Building Artworks. I'm Seema
and I'm Amelia Bain. Each episode, Seema and I will invite a rotating cast of fellow writers and artists to discuss a book that we love.
We hope you'll read along and join the conversation. For this month's book club podcast, we're doing something a little different that we may continue doing, actually. We have a combination of some of the facilitators and book club podcast voices you've come to know, and participants who signed up via a lottery and joined us. We had veterans, other writers joining this conversation about the beautiful book City of Laughter by Temim Fruchter, and we hope you'll enjoy the conversation. Temim Fruchter is a queer, non-binary Jewish writer who was raised modern Orthodox. She holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Maryland, has received first prize in short fiction from both American Literary Review and New South, and is a Rana Jaffe Foundation Writers Award winner. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, and joined our conversation from her home there. Temim, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to meet all of you.
It is so great to have you. We've known each other for a long time, mostly Instagram, and a few book events together over the years. And I went to your launch, bought this book, and then read it so slowly because the sentence work is so phenomenal that I had to reread sentences again and again and just be like, stop people and read them to them. There's a poet sensibility in this writing. And my first question, and I'll ask the first question, but please don't make me ask all the questions. I know you have questions, everyone else. But my first question for you is, what is the interplay between story and poetry for you here? Like, did any of this start as poetry? I know you mentioned that you listen to a lot of music while you write, and I was just wondering if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah. This is so fun. Thank you for having me. I think of myself as a fiction/prose writer with a poet's heart. I sort of came up as a poet. I was way too verbose to be, not that poets can't also be verbose, but I think I had a professor in my undergrad at some point who was like, "So are you familiar with editing?" So I had a lot to say. But I do think that when I'm building prose, when I'm building fiction, I tend to really rely on the very sort of almost physical texture of language to build a scene, for example. And that feels to me like it comes from a poet place more than a prose writer place, like building the layers of language and sort of letting, for example, like a bedroom or a forest or something introduce itself to me through the images that come to me, through the adjectives and the language I use. Because sometimes, frankly, a novel is like a weird dark room that you're kind of shining a tiny flashlight your way into. And I think sometimes when I let the language lead, when I think, oh, I think there was a scene where I was trying to imagine a forest, and I imagined I had been to Vermont, where there's this beautiful puppet museum from the Bread and Puppet sort of political puppet theater company. And for some reason I imagined that. And I was like, why am I imagining that? But I just sort of went with it. And, that ultimately most of that didn't stay, but the language sort of led me into the scene and what was happening. And so I guess that's how I come at it from the poety perspective that sort of raised me.
I love that idea of trusting the language to lead you to where the story needs to go, trusting the images. That's so beautiful.
I keep thinking about the potato plant. That whole like story within a story that you do that nesting doll story format that I just love. I mean, yes, we can definitely gush about the book and how wonderful it was. Unlike Seema, I read it quick. I flew through that, and I do not like digital. I don't like reading on a screen, but that's how they sent it to me. And I was traveling, and it was really convenient actually. I was like, oh, I do have a book to read, and middle of the night in London was reading your book. It was amazing. Um, but that potato plant scene, that whole story of a potato plant, of like choosing the ugly potatoes and planting them outside the city, and then this huge plant grows and it's the most beautiful thing ever. And it made me want to go look for potato plants. I'm like, I bet they are pretty. It's sort of like blackberries are gorgeous. And I love blackberries. They're delicious and they're gorgeous. And they're incredibly painful and such a pest at the same time. Like, it's like, oh my God, they're taking over my yard. And I'm like, do I just let them? Like, what do I do? But that potato plant, like taking over the bridge, like just like kind of swallowing the bridge and then it no longer existing. Um, yeah, that was a really wild, like you do these sort of, I was like, is it a chain? Are these like linked? Like this sort of green-eyed girl phantom is like generational apparently. That's this weird, like it's like a spiral but it's like a link. It's a Ouroboros. Like I'm like, what shape are you making with these stories that like twist and weave back within themselves? I also really appreciated this sort of, we got some answers. The character got some answers, but we didn't get all the answers. The grandmother didn't suddenly become like an open book. We didn't get that peek in. Um, why? I guess my question is like, or one of my questions, I have lots of questions, but like, why did you give us the notebook?
Yeah, thanks, Amber. I thanks for loving the potato
Oh my
story.
gosh, I love the whole book. I love the whole book.
Thank you.
I'm so sad that the ghost happened. Yeah, I love the whole book. Okay,
Thank you
but
so much.
but why did you give us a notebook?
Why the notebook specifically? Um, I I think so the notebook is um was sort of like represented the character of Syl, who is like the second from the earliest generation in this book. Um, she she I think I knew from pretty early on was going to be the person who is the least accessible to anyone. And I think that she wanted it that way. Both the fictional person and like my character just sort of resisted. I experimented with having her speak, and she didn't seem to want to. And so I think I wanted to give both myself and the reader and Hannah, her daughter, just like a little bit of access to her because it felt too stingy to share nothing. And it felt like, even though she resisted being fully revealed, um, I felt like she had to live somewhere in a more intimate way. And I also, in this book, was really interested in the epistolary, not just through letters, like literal letters, but sort of how we communicate. You asked about shape, and I was thinking a lot about what shape time can take and time travel can take when we are trying to commune with our dead and with our ancestors, particularly when those people's stories are pretty lost to us. And I think, often that takes the shapes of objects, communications, things that maybe they didn't intend for us to see, not necessarily sort of neat bundles of letters that, we get their whole story, but just sort of little snippets or clues that give us some inkling about how they lived. And so for me, those notebooks were that, and they were sort of Syl in the book wants those notebooks destroyed. So it's a little bit transgressive too. It's never, it's not neat the way that we sometimes learn about our families. It often requires sort of uncomfortable transgression, sometimes boundary crossing. And so I wanted it to be a little complicated too.
That's really, thank you. I I didn't think about that as like being transgressive against, like that's its own transgression to give us that. I loved that she was a mystery. It didn't feel like she was unknown. It felt like she was just unknown to us. Like we did Hannah and and the doc, like nobody got access to her, but somebody did. And that was really just beautifully like a beautiful mystery woven throughout that was just captivating. Thank you so much. And yes, again, your way of stacking these scenes, like the space where the queer porn showing happened, right? Like I could see the people moving in the space. I could see the light. Like I was there. And same thing with the potato plant. Like there's these really crisp, juicy, like full. Yeah, even the two meeting in the alley, the two thinkers meeting in the alley. Um, the like imagined, it was Einstein. Who was it meeting in the
I
alley?
Yeah,
Einstein
Einstein
and
on ski. Yeah.
yes, thank you. I was like, right. So yes, the two of them meeting together in the alley and having that interaction. Like there's just so much juice in these sort of like tangential, like you're like it's like a little root system of stories, and really deliciously done. Um, Short stories within a long story. That's really cool.
I guess I just want to expand a little bit on Amber's question because we have this multi-generational story, these four women, and each of the stories, each of their stories gets told and told like in a very satisfying way. I felt like I got a satisfying grasp and a fairly complete picture of each story, even when we didn't get all the details. And I kind of was like, how, like, how did you come up with the way that each story would be told? Because each one kind of gets a different treatment. And I wondered how much you experimented with different ways of telling each woman's story.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I did experiment a lot, and it was sort of iterative how it came to be. I originally, the sort of seed of the origin for this book was seeing a picture of well, there's a couple origins, but the one that's relevant to your question is like seeing a picture of my grandmother, who is like a pretty, she wasn't the same as Syl, but she was very private, sort of very into like being dignified and private person. And I remember seeing pictures of her from when she was, in her 20s, and she just looks like this beautiful, mischievous starlet. And I personally was just coming into sort of like queer femme identity at the time. And I was like, oh, we could be friends. Like that could be someone who I like admired and adored from afar at a party. And, you know, like I always say, I'm not asserting that I secretly believe she was queer, though that would be cool. But what it made me think was I wouldn't really know if she was. I wouldn't know if I had a queer lineage. And so the exercise of making this book was like just imagining and speculating a queer femme lineage for myself. And so in thinking about that, each generation felt like it called for a different way of telling its story, right? So like I was talking about Syl, she was a little bit she was a little bit cagier, and I ended up mostly telling her story through other people. And then, Syl and Hannah are the more, I'm sorry, Shiva and Hannah are the more contemporary characters. And so their stories are kind of in conversation in the present. And the letters from the great grandmother Mira came last. And I think at the beginning, I thought, I want this story to sort of play with the fantasy that I think I know I have and that people I know have of like finding somewhere in an attic, like just a bundle that contains like this magical story of your ancestral past. And knowing that that's often not possible. And I thought, what if those letters aren't accessible to the characters, but they exist? And so I thought of them as like a frequency that, if you tuned into that frequency, like you're listening to the radio, um, they're there. Like you're not necessarily going to find them, but maybe you can insist that they're there and maybe they are. And so, yeah, I think it was a little bit like of an existential spiritual writing process more so than it was like informed by craft strategy. But I think I knew it was always going to be sort of a collage of approaches. And then in the end, I just tried to sort of tie them all together the best I could.
I loved your book, Tina. And I was intrigued by the intergenerational stuff and Mira's story, especially. And in your book, it appeared to me that the way her father treated her may have affected how she raised her children. I know as a being raised by a post-Holocaust father that he had a lot of secrets and he really didn't know what to do with us as kids. So I'm wondering if that was intentional, the way Hannah's relationship with Shiva was.
Thank you so much, Raye. I really appreciate it. Yeah, definitely intentional. Just in sort of thinking about the ways that intergenerational trauma gets passed down, if not in explicit ways, then in sort of sidelong ways. And also just the way that silencing can be really toxic and can happen in all kinds of ways. In Mira's case, it's very sort of literal, explicit silencing by her father. But like you're pointing out, I think across the generations, there is a kind of compulsory silencing and almost guarding or policing of certain kinds of talking or information or acting out. And I do think, I think some of that comes from the women themselves, but some of that is certainly intergenerational. And I wanted sort of like queerness and loudness and laughter and all these ways of being that might threaten that kind of silence to be what ultimately triumphed in the book. But for it to be kind of a tangle between those things. And it's not always, it's not always easy to shake off that kind of trauma or shake off those learned ways of being. And so I wanted that there too.
Right. And Hannah's story, of her being in the funeral home, and processing the bodies for death. Uh that struck a chord with me as well. And and the person with the very green eyes, her appearance and disappearance and appearance and disappearance, you know. It was a great story. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That means a lot to me.
Hi, Temim. Thank you so much for coming. I'm super stoked to be part of this. Wow, what a book. I'm so struck by so many things. One, I want to ask you first about, you said you were inspired. So then did you write it knowing kind of did you have a structure? Or did you kind of write it and these characters kind of came to you slowly and they said, oh, this is how I want to tell my story? Or there's so much, sorry, I'll stop asking questions, but there's so much uncertainty about everything that it's lovely. I feel like it really speaks to me and my life. I've never identified as queer, but I have a young friend that is coming into that. And it's so interesting to hear her because it's like, what are you talking about? How are you asking yourself these questions? I was never allowed to ask these questions. And it's like Hannah, right? She's like, she sees the green-eyed woman, but never says to herself, oh, wait, this is my spouse? What? Because it's like, no, of course not. But there's someone significant. It's something significant, right? Anyway, I could go on a long time. Please. Did you come out really late? Or, I know that's very personal, but like what inspired you to kind of bring in this level of uncertainty? Is it being a woman that we're not allowed to know our feelings? We're kind of told what we feel, what we think, what we know. I'll stop.
I love all those questions. Thank you so much, Amy. So I think you asked about sort of the the uncertainty and the structure, right? So I think no, I didn't have any idea what the structure was going to be. I um I started this functionally like when I was in my MFA in from 2017 to 2019, and I knew like the themes. I knew I was interested in folklore, in queerness, in sort of speculative history, as people call it, sort of like my family but not my family. Um but yeah, no, I just kind of wrote in snippets. I wrote the pieces I was excited about. I'm a pretty chaotic writer. Like I was like, ooh, I want to write a scene at a like a mikveh, at a ritual bath. And so I wrote that. And the stories that Amber was bringing up, the little folkloric snippets, I'd write one of those, and I just wasn't really sure how it was going to thread together. And then eventually it took I thought of it almost as like painting a room, like it's like the first layer and the second layer, and eventually it started to cohere. But I think uncertainty is a really important part of this story, as you picked up on. And I think for me, like something really central to my life has been, I referenced there's this folklore in the Passover ritual that is these four children, the wise one, the wicked one, the simple one, and the one who doesn't know how to ask. I think the one who doesn't know how to ask often gets a bad rap because it's just like, well, I don't know, it's like it's painted as a little bit like foolish or something. And I think we live in kind of a world where like I often don't know what the question Libra, yeah, even what the questions are. And so I think I wanted to write a book that was like that, where being haunted by questions that you can't even figure out the language for feels like a really important part to me of being a human. Like when I'm doing it right, well, I'm never doing it right, but when I'm like being, I guess, most authentic to myself is when I admit how little I understand. And so, yeah, I wanted that to come across both structurally and in terms of the characters. And also I think I would have had no choice but to have that come across, because that's just what I struggle with, and I wanted that present in the book.
Can I ask one more quick thing for clarity? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Raye mentioned like being brought, having the influence of a relative that went through the Holocaust, and I feel like with my Jewish friends, there's also like I have a friend also whose mom went through it and survived and came to the US, and there's this level of like not only uncertainty but not wanting to talk about it. So as an outsider, feeling like I never know quite what to ask, or I feel like it's safer not to ask anything, but at the same time, that's impossible for me, and impossible not to stick my foot in my mouth and kind of. But I feel like it's the same way with queerness. Like I'm super curious about a lot of things, but I'll ask things like I feel like anytime I ask, I get kind of in trouble. And so did you combine the two, the Jewish and the queerness, because they both have this level, or is that just something I'm bringing into it?
I mean, first of all, I feel like what you're bringing into it is welcome, but also I think, yeah, I mean, the Jewish and the queer are just both the sort of the primary lenses through which I experience the world. I do think that, you know, for me, like as someone who I consider myself like a lifelong learner, and I think that it is important to, I don't know, it's important to have permission in stories and in conversation to sort of just like keep learning about the ways that these things work. I mean, for me, you asked about queerness. I came out in my mid-20s, but I think I didn't I didn't know sort of like the language. I didn't really understand what it meant. It was just more of an impulse at that time. And I think queerness and frankly Jewishness is like a lifelong process of just sort of figuring out what the questions are and figuring out what these identities mean and how they're salient. And, I will say even and especially, like living through this moment of witnessing a genocide unfolding, you purportedly in the name of Jewish safety, it feels like I'm constantly in conversations about what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be questioning in my Jewish identity. And so I think I'm not answering your question, but I do appreciate it. And I think that like, I don't think that you're reading into it that this book is about sort of questions that feel forbidden to ask and how do we figure out how to ask them anyway.
Thanks so much for that thoughtful answer, Temim, and those thoughtful, brave questions, Amy. I mean, this is what like literature makes possible, right? This is how we get to inhabit other lives, other lenses. And so like I want to sort of underscore it to you, Amy, like reading more. And I got a whole book list for you if you want it. But particularly fiction. I think I mean, memoir is great, but fiction is this beautiful thing where you have to be reminded that this is just a story, right? That you just are listening to this story. I don't know. There's a lot with empathy in fiction. So thank you. Leena.
Hi, I'm Leena, and my wife's name is Mira.
Hi.
So, we have not read the book because I haven't been able to access it. We need it on audiobook. I'm legally blind, and my wife is completely blind. So a question with that is, would you consider submitting your audiobook to the National Library Access Services? That way, those of us that are blind and can't read, regular print could have access to your book as well. So there's that question. And Mira wants to know more about Mira. We listened to your YouTube reading back. I think it was listed on for January 18th with Mara, and it was great to hear the sections that were read and everything. So and there was brought up about, hey, have you thought about doing like the little short stories with the things you didn't put in the book? So it's been a few months. I was wondering if there's any update on that.
Hi, Leena and Mira. Thank you so much for those questions. And yes, I would love the audiobook to be as accessible as possible to anyone who wants it. I know it's available for purchase. I think it's available via Libby, like the library app. But if there is a way to specifically submit it for more accessibility, I would love to learn more about that for sure. And thank you for listening to that to the YouTube of my book launch. I will say there has not been any more development on working on those. Leena is referring to in my book launch event, we talked about how there were some fictional made up Jewish folk tales that I had written for the book that ended up getting cut because they didn't really fit. And so we were sort of talking about maybe publishing them in a separate book. That's not, maybe one day. I'll keep you posted. But I will definitely tell you more about Mira. She is based on my own great grandmother. I don't think they're necessarily alike in personality or history. But my great grandmother I knew her until I was 12. She passed away when I was 12. She was from Rupshitz, Poland, which was a Jewish shtetl that I write about in the book. And she had these smiling eyes, like she smiled with her whole face. And so her eyes would just squint really tiny, and she was very quiet. But something about the way that she smiled and like just looked so joyous, it just made me think there's so much behind that face that I don't know and that I probably won't know. Just very soft-spoken, lovely. She used to put out this one dish of like chocolate mints and one dish of golden raisins. And my brother and I would sort of like come in, and sometimes it would be the chocolate and sometimes it would be the raisins, and we'd be like, damn it, it's the raisins. Like we always wanted the chocolate. But yeah, that's who Mira is based on. And I didn't know her. Like I said, the letters from Mira came last in this writing, came later. And when I started to get to know her, I adored her. I was so I also have a very loud laugh, and I like to imagine that that comes from my ancestral place. So it was really fun to write someone who was so other in this way that delighted me and that felt like, someone I was really related to.
This is more of those kind of questions, and I think Amy is also asking those kind of questions. That's our genetic, I'm sure. I love that. Yeah, this sort of I love what you just said, Seema, about fiction, especially being like a portal into you can't other it in a way because it's already othered. It's inherently othered. So you can't just be like, oh, like that's for other people. It's like you're literally choosing to enter a world. I don't know. There's something very interesting about that. And that makes me think about how you chose fiction for this. Like you're pointing out all these different ways in which your own history, your own experience. I felt very much um the trap of fiction. I felt very much like I was getting to know you a little bit through Shiva. Like I was like, oh, okay, this is sort of you telling on yourself a little bit too, right? Like even just how you were talking about like your writing being chaotic. And I was thinking about like the way I love that entry into how her brain works. And then she's just like, look, it's gonna come the way it's gonna come. It's gonna happen when it happens. So I have those kind of questions too of like how much of this was really is a way to explore your story, but giving yourself the permission essentially to enter it fictionally, and like how much of it is your story in terms of your own experience, and including like did you go to Poland and Ropshitz to do research? Uh, Sit on a park bench. Like I love that idea of sitting on a park bench. I totally understand that going to a foreign place and sitting in a park or a public place and just sitting outward and letting it come to you. I love that imagery too. So yeah, same kind of stories that Amy's putting here in the chat. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, definitely like no, none of these characters is me or is a member of my family, but definitely you're getting to know me through this book. And definitely it was a way to explore some of my own hauntings, my own questions, to try to commune with my own ancestors. I think that I'm a pretty like spiritual person, so I really do feel kind of prayerful about writing as a process. I think, and I don't even have to mean that in a deeply religious way, but just sort of it's a way of trying to have a dialogue with people I can't see, with forces I can't see. And so that felt important to me in the book. I'm also a really external processor. And so sometimes I don't know what I think until I've written it down. And so I think writing this story was a way of figuring out how I was relating to my own sort of ancestral context and what my questions were. And then sort of like forming them. I think the speculative piece is really empowering, right? Because some of this is obviously most all of it, most to all of it is fiction, but just giving myself permission to make stuff up and to be like the way I'm going to honor Rupshitz, which is, this very real place where people lived and that was eventually destroyed and that, whose legacy I really wanted to respect, but honor it in a way that was like making up stories and taking the folklore that I was given and sort of doing something really imaginative with it in the spirit of laughter, for example. So yeah, I mean, I think those parts are certainly in the book. I'm a chaotic writer. I'm a chaotic researcher. So those parts are right on. Me and Shiva would be buds. I did go to Warsaw. I went to Warsaw. I used to play in a band for many years, and we went to Warsaw when I was on tour, and we actually drove to Rupshitz, or where Rupshitz had once been, where the village had once been. And it frankly was so mundane and underwhelming. It was just like road, grass, trees. And I had this like, and maybe people can relate to this. I've talked to people who do. I had this like twin set of feelings. One was, oh my God, this is such a bummer. There's like nothing here. And the other was, oh my God, this place is charged. Like there are spirits everywhere. Like the air is thick with them. And so I think both of those things are true a lot of the time, especially in these narratives where we like go back somewhere to try to find something. It's never clear cut. So anyway, I did go. That was a big part of the inspiration for the book. And then a few years ago in 2018, I went back and just sort of walked around a lot, sat on park benches, tried to understand like the sort of textures of everyday life there. And that was more toward writing the book.
Thanks to me. I love this way that you made the invisible visible, the unbelievable believable in telling these stories, including, I think, that Shiva never really sees Hannah, though we do as the reader. And like we can hope that in the future there's some visibility between them or transparency. But we also know that like realistically that's not what happens, right? And that doesn't keep it from existing, just because Shiva can't see Hannah. And I really appreciated that, like as a mom of adults now, right? There's so often we're writing the story from one point of view or the other. It's the, misunderstood kid or the misunderstood mom. But in this story, I think, like very few other stories, we were able to see them both as whole and completely misunderstood by each other. And I really, really appreciated that.
I love that both misunderstood in both directions. I think that was really beautiful. One of the things that I found so compelling was having the voice of the messenger as a sort of across time and what that did to time in the novel. And then there's also these moments of time that are just like tiny and perfect. Like on page 330, there's where you have this description of time where it's like, I wanted to go from flannel to linen with you, to go from scotch to gin, from long walks to movie theaters, to pick fresh flowers or spruce boughs for some warmly laid table. Like this time expressed through the changing of the seasons and this really lovingly described, imagined, longer love affair. And so I was just really interested in how you thought about time as you were putting things together, how you balance sort of this being that's outside of time with these very we even have the grandmother and the granddaughter passing as one dies as one is born. So I just love to hear what how you kind of thought about time as you were putting things together and how you balance this timelessness with the very real sort of fact of mortality.
Thank you for that, for calling out that part and for that question. I mean, I think as a writer, one of my main like not even secret, just like one of the reasons I write is to like wrestle with the reality of time and mortality. I think that is so central to what writing feels like it makes possible, is that it enables time travel, it enables like time bending and talking to the dead and all of this. And so I knew that when I started the book, oh, I don't know if I knew when I started, but pretty early on, I knew that I was concerned with letters and sort of career ship, like people carrying dispatches from one places to another. And I think that it just became clear that I needed somebody to sort of carry the story, and I wanted an omniscient narrator who had sort of seen it all. When I was talking earlier about speculating a queer lineage, I was interested in what it would mean for, all of these women in this one matrilineal line to have been touched by the same shape-shifting messenger, or sort of an iteration of that messenger. And it was, I mean, it was really fun to play with, but also, like you said, it sort of allowed me to break the rules of linear time. And I specifically, think about that a lot as like a queer, non-binary person. I think about this idea of queer time and like, and I think for some people and for, in a lot of contexts, that simply means queer people can be on a different timeline than other people. We don't have the same temporal markers, right? Necessarily, obviously some queer people do get married and own houses and have children, and some of us just don't do those things. And those things often mark time. And so time can be marked differently. I like to think about queer time as, even more expansive than that. Like queerness of imagination, queerness of literary form as a thing that might allow us to think about the rigidities of time differently. Sometimes that's just me being human and wanting stubbornly to believe that like things are possible that aren't possible. But I think the great thing about fiction is that fiction makes those things possible. And so, yeah, I mean, the way I was thinking of time was how can I make the queerest possible relationship to time, and the scene that somebody called out earlier about, just throwing Einstein and Ansky in an alleyway and like just sort of like letting time almost glitch, sort of crack open, revealing things and then close again. Um, I guess time is sort of an inconsistent character, but the messenger, you're right, did allow me to be like way more expansive with it, which was fun.
So I'm curious, what you studied before you did your MFA. Was it something of passion and interest? Was it Jewish studies? So on page 259, you say, she did not email Rosenbach that she was dazzled by the assiduousness with which people charted a course of historic study that was also equally and always a love story. This just blew me open. I studied Chinese, hoped to get my PhD and was sidetracked by a professor. But wow, I mean, it is truly a love story. I mean, I love that literature. So that I love that line and I love that idea. So I just have to ask, did you feel that way about your studies?
Thank you. I went to my undergrad like many years ago. So 2002, I graduated. And I studied English with a minor in women's studies. And I loved, I mean, like I said before, I'm a constant learner. I love studying, I love learning, but I'm not an academic. I think I have a lot of awe and admiration for people whose brains work that way, but and so I think the book reflects my own sort of veracity for knowledge and for learning, and also just an admiration for people who can think in those ways. I think that it was fun to write a character who was really excited and electrified by academia, but also realized that there were a lot of limitations in terms of what she actually might be able to do in that space.
I was trying to read the chat because I had put something in about she had mentioned about the queer timelines and whatnot, and I had stated that Mira talks frequently about rewriting the past, her past from before, and about how she wasn't in the body she was born with, and so she talks frequently about wishing that she could go back and rewrite that, and she does, and she actually does it through stories. Sometimes she actually writes the stories out with a different way. So I was just throwing that in the chat.
Thank you, Leena. The line that Amy brought up of the love story of studying, there's so many love stories in this novel, and maybe the love story that's my favorite is Hannah finding her way to like this love story with herself, in all of this like secret keeping for her mother, from her mother, with her mother, and then through this idea of I'm conflating the woman with the green eyes with the messenger. Is that right? um yeah, and I was just like, I love all of these other ways to think about a love story rather than just like a partner pair forever. and really appreciated that.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to give Hannah, I fell in love with Hannah over the course of writing the book. And yeah, it was exciting to figure out how she could fall in love with herself and sort of figure out her own desire and like smack in the middle of her life.
I've been saying that like every love story is a grief story, especially these days. And I think that that's exactly it. Like when the hero of the story is not who you think the hero of the story is, or the hero of the story is multi-layered. And so getting to love Hannah, while Hannah learns to love herself is was really, really beautiful, especially for like, I don't know. I mean, I wanted to relate to Shiva, and I was like, I do in some ways, right? Like I connect definitely with the longing and the wandering and the ghosts, the haunting and all that stuff. Yeah, but it was Hannah at the end that had like the real tenderness and vulnerability. I have two things that I just want to clarify because now it's come up a couple of times. Every time there's a green-eyed girl that seduces one of the generations, it's the messenger. It's an iteration of the messenger. Is that the idea? I just want to know. I want to be
Oh
clear.
no, yeah. I mean, I like the reader to decide what they think, but I mean, yes, ultimately, like I wanted the shape shifting messenger is signified by those green eyes. And yeah, I think there's a little bit of room for interpretation in terms of like what shape that creature, that character, that spirit takes. But
Mm.
yes, you're correct.
So then, follow-up question, but not the second question. Is the shapeshifter based on somebody that you encountered at some point and have like, is it a fantasy person? Is it somebody who broke your heart? Is it an ex? Is it your current lover? I want to know. I'm being nosy and I want to know. So you
Okay,
don't have
now we're getting to the
to.
gossip. Um,
Yes, spill the tea to me. Spill the tea.
so I will say no. The short answer is no. However, I was ghosted in a very annoying way. A number of years ago, I was going back and forth with someone on Tinder, brilliant chemistry, and we never actually met. This person canceled 4 different dates. We lived in different cities. Um, this person lived in New York. I would like come visit New York because I had friends here anyway. Person would cancel. The reasons were always pretty good, but then by the fourth time, I was like, something weird is going on. Just great chemistry. And then this person ghosted, never to be heard from again. And I was like, man, that's disrespectful and also really disappointing. And like, it's that kind of like very humbling human grief of like, wow, I clearly had a fantasy of this person I didn't even know. And now I'm crying over a person I never even knew. And so that dynamic, it's not about that person specifically, but that dynamic and that feeling of like, oh my God, like this is so embarrassing to be rejected and to be rejected by someone I've never even met is even more humbling. And so I wanted to like, it was sort of just cathartic to write the whole ghosting plot line for Shiva because I was like, ah. So that's as much goss as I can give,
I
really.
love it. No, that was perfect. That was just enough because there's something about that, like that was a haunting too, right? That like this character is somebody who like it leaves you with a question. It left me with a question of like when it's a big deal to you, and how can it be a big deal to you if it wasn't a big deal? And somehow, like you said, like why am I crying over this? Like the way that they can linger or like hook onto you, even if there was never anything. I thought that was really brilliantly done. My other question was, oh, this is just like me maybe not knowing enough. So if you want to direct me to like resources, I'd also be really interested. But how much of the like Jewish mythology, history, and even like the messenger character. It felt very like trickster character, Mercury, like and there's a lot of different mythologies that have some kind of like messenger, winged character, courier character, something like that. So how much of that like came from like what you studied and know, and how much of it was like your fantasy you're made of, including Ansky? Like how much of that is like I'm like, can I go and find this person and like do a deep study of this thinker and read the report, the survey that he did? I'm so curious.
Yes, yes to all of those last questions. Ansky is real. The Dybbuk is a real play. The ethnographic study, I'm looking to see if I have it. No, it's somewhere, but it's why. I mean, it's really, really wild. And I deeply fell in love with him as a thinker, as an activist, as a, just as a person while I was writing the book. Um, in terms of the what else did you ask about? The messenger, the folk
Yeah, is
tales.
there like a myth? Is there like a Jewish version
Oh,
of like
right, the trickster.
messenger or a courier or something like that?
So sort of, I mean, I think like my sort of philosophy, that sounds grandiose. My like approach to writing the folkloric parts of this book, we was just to give myself permission to play with the tropes from the Jewish folklore I grew up with, or sometimes not even the tropes, sometimes just the feeling, the feeling of like somebody telling a story about, there was a king and he had there's often a king and then there's often like two daughters or three sons, and there's sort of archetypal. It's like a lot of folklore. It's and so to just use the feeling of the folklore that I had grown up with, but to make it my own. Um, I don't know. There certainly might be trickster characters. Something that's really prominent in Jewish folklore that I grew up with is often like a beggar who's like dressed in rags, but is secretly either like a great rabbi, a prophet, something like that. Often Elijah the prophet gets dressed up in rags, or like, shows up at your door and he's a strange, mysterious visitor, and you don't know until later who it really was. And so I was always taken with that, probably as like a young Orthodox Jewish kid who was really sheltered and hoped that one day a stranger would come to my door and like deliver a surprising message and, take me away from all this mess. Not in a creepy way, like in a consensual good way. But but yeah, so I think there's definitely like some model for the trickster character. And I think I didn't actually know that S. Ansky's The Dybbuk had a narrator called the messenger until quite far into drafting the book. And so it was kind of meta because, like Shiva, I sort of discovered the messenger and was like, oh my God, like I'm already writing a character like this, and here they are. And so it was really exciting, actually.
Thank you, Temim, for being here with us. All of you for being here to ask these really, really brilliant and wonderful questions. For reading alongside of us. You'll be the first to know what our next book club book is. I'm going to put it in the chat. Some of you already know about this book. I'm very excited about it. It is called Someplace Generous. It is an anthology. Edited by our very own Amber Flame, and including a story by Temim, and get a jump on that book. I'm really like, in terms of ways to enter the portal of more stories, there's nothing like an anthology. There's nothing like a fiction anthology in particular. And I'm really, really, really excited to read this one. And thank you all for your time, your attention, to meme your generosity with your time. And I'll see y'all all a lot, I hope, in the next weeks.
Thank you all so
Well,
much. I appreciate you.
please join us next time for our discussion of the romance anthology, Someplace Generous. And the link to that book will be in our show notes. We're really, really excited to read that book with all of you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being a part of this.
CBAW Loves is a community building artworks podcast produced by Amelia Bain.
CBAW is committed to mission belonging, reconnecting veterans with their communities.
For more information, visit our website, www.cbaw.org.